All right, I think we're up to about 100 on the Zoom today, so welcome to everyone. We're so happy that you're here. This is
Wow.
one in a
Oh my
monthly series
gosh.
that we do on different topics. I'm going to ask everyone to mute themselves, except for the speakers, as we get ready to begin. If you do have questions over the course of the program, feel free to enter them in the chat. I'll keep track of that, and if there's a clarifying question for one of our speakers, then I'll interrupt them and ask it. Otherwise, we'll save questions till all three of our speakers have had a chance to have their say, and then we'll have hopefully a lively discussion for the second part of our program today. I don't want to say this afternoon or this morning
I
because
know.
we're from all different time zones,
Yeah.
but we'll all have a chance to jump in. The panelists will tell you a little bit about themselves, I think, as they get started, but I want to let you know who's with us today. The first speaker is going to be Adria Bernardi. Oh, or it could be Adria. I said I was going to say Adria, and I said Adria, which is
Either
more the
works.
Italian pronunciation. Adria is an accomplished writer and translator, and she's going to be reading a brief passage from Benefit Street, which is an experimental novel that has won several literature prizes. And it's about cultural displacement, and it draws on the process of weaving, kilim, sorry, left out one of those vowels, a kilim, or a Turkish tapestry. Is that right? Is Turkish? Okay. The second speaker is Mary Jo Bona, who's a professor at Stony Brook. Is it university? I was
Yes.
going to say SUNY Stony Brook, but
You
I
could say
looked at
that
your
too.
bio and it's like you don't say SUNY anymore.
Well, we can do both.
Okay, very good. Um, she has held many administrative roles, but she works primarily in women's studies and literature. And she's going to talk about how textiles renew relationships and inspire kinship across time and distance. Um, the third speaker is Cameron Taylor Brown, who is a weaver. We've been Facebook friends for a number of years, but we didn't meet in person until you were here for
Mhm.
Convergence
Right.
last year. Cameron started what I think is a fascinating project called Art Garage, where she's keeping the weaving traditions alive through an active teaching practice.
Mm.
And she's also very well regarded and has been in lots of exhibits of textiles. And she's going to share some images and discuss recent works of textile art and talk about her process and the relationship between her own writing process and weaving. So this is a little bit different program than the ones we usually bring to you, but I think it'll be stimulating for a lot of you. It'll stimulate your own comments and questions. So I think we're about ready to get started. But Kelsey, is there anything you need to say before we do?
I would just say welcome to everyone. I want to share that we last month launched a brand new Warp website. It's the same URL as always, weavearealpiece.org. But if you're new to Warp, we are an international textile networking organization, and I encourage you to visit our website and learn more about us. And also, all of our monthly programs are recorded and available on the website, so you'll be able to find those there. And again, welcome, and I'll turn it back over to you, Judy.
Okay. Adria, would you like to get us started?
I will. Thank you. So hello to everyone out there across the World Wide Web. I was going to say afternoon, but then I realized, as you said, Judy, that's not the case. So I wanted to, first of all, to thank Warp and to thank Kelsey and to thank Judy for extending this invitation to us, particularly to me and to Mary Jo, who are not visual artists. We aren't textile artists. So thank you. And this began as a way for us to talk about our mutual interest in textiles. And my novel, Benefit Street, is about friendships and work of women in an unnamed city, in an unnamed country. Its narrator, Shiva, is a political refugee who is telling the story of her displacement. And textiles, in particular, the kilim, the flat weave rug, became one of the essential ways in which her story became woven together. After the novel was published, I realized that one of the conversations I really wanted to have was with a weaver. I was interested and curious about the weaver's processes of imagining and making, and how ideas happen, and how, in particular, how choices are made about materials. That really it's just something, because I know how I choose my materials. I know about that process with words, and I was curious about that conversation. So that's what led me to Weave a Real Piece. I started looking for organizations whose ethos somehow matched how I see Benefit Street. And when I read that Warp's vision of itself is a catalyst for improving the quality of life of textile weavers, artisans worldwide, and dedication to making connections across the globe, I felt a real resonance with that. And that's what led me to Cameron Taylor Brown's work. And again, I think her artist statement about how she sees starting with something and making something whole out of what wasn't there before into something complex that connects. That also really resonated with me in terms of Benefit Street. And then I've known Mary Jo for years. And I was interested in bringing her study, which is on textiles in works of fiction and women writing cloth. And I really wanted to have her in this discussion. So that's how the three of us came together to have this discussion. I'm going to read 4 very short passages from Benefit Street, and they reflect the theme portability, to carry something. And the first 2 go together, and then the second 2 go together. So I'm going to read those. The first passage involves a rug that is carried by Shiva as she leaves. It's the only thing she can take. And then the second involves a rug that is gifted by one woman to her caretaker, Emish. Emish is the caretaker, so that Emish can lead a better life and continue making her art, which is weaving kilims. So this is from Benefit Street. Our kilims hung on the walls. We lived in those rooms among them. The kilims hung on the walls of our dining and sitting rooms. The red and blue Obruk prayer rug with a date below the mihrab's peak. The one rug from Shivas with stars woven into the border. In the melas, reds and yellows predominated. And in the sivrizar, diamonds were woven inside diamonds. We carried only the konya yastik with us. We could each take 3 books. I could rebuild the library. We fled in the middle of the night. I said, pack your backpack with what you need most in the world. He packed the book of true explanations of why things are the way they are. He packed the book of Dede Korkut. He packed Treasure Island. I rolled up the Konya rug. I packed 3 books. A car was waiting downstairs. Dikat, she said, be careful. She pointed to the edge of the carpet, that bulge. She asked Emish to smooth it. It was a melas rug with vertical bands, alternating in cinnamon red and a deep amber. It was cheerful. In each of the amber bands, there were 12 shapes, the gulbudak. an angular octagonal shape open that looked like two sharp-beaked birds facing away from each other 5 times around a wheel, not unlike a cog. Do you see that rug? She asked that her body be wrapped in it, then placed on a ladder and carried to the cemetery near the lake at the end of the city. Afterwards, she said to Emish, bring the sumac to the museum between the ancient hill and the bazaar. The other rug, she said, pointing to the runner, the one with the bulge, take it to the merchant Demir. Wait 2 months. At first, he won't give you a good price. Tell him I have been carried out on a ladder, out towards the lake. Then he'll pay you what it's worth. It's ancient. Sell it. It's yours. During the long revision process of this book is a book I started writing in about 2002 during the US involvement in Afghanistan and the US war in Iraq. Refugees were very much on my mind, as they are now. During the revision process, the woven rug began to reveal itself in new ways. It was already in there, it was always in there, but it began to really assert itself. And I began to conceptualize the text itself as a long runner. There's an image of it here now that's going to go up on the screen. And what I did is I taped the printed out pages of the manuscript and I taped them together. So you can see on the one on the left is basically all the pages from this manuscript I taped together, you know, bottom to top, bottom to top, bottom to top, bottom to top. And you can see on the one on the right, it's not that clear, but you can see up at the top by that yellow Post-it note, there's a piece of tape, and then there's another one down at the, I just used Scotch tape. I used what I had on hand. And so I taped them all together, and I just really started experiencing this, this manuscript visually as a runner, as a very, very long runner. And so the second group of images, which is going to come up now, so thank you. When I had this very unwieldy manuscript, I had to decide whether or not I was going to basically roll it up or fold it. And I knew that I didn't want to roll it because I didn't want to think about it as a scroll. So I folded it. And when I took these pictures, the folds really jumped out at me. And this was following our conversation for this event, particularly I associated with Cameron's work, which a couple slides, which she's going to show later on. So anyway, I kept another thing which I did is I imagined this as a long runner. I tried to emphasize its verticality. So I narrowed the margins and I did different things with the text. And one of the things that I did, and so this will be the third picture here. The rug on the right is one that I've had for a really long time in our home. And in a lot of ways, it spoke to me. I didn't know what it was saying. I wondered about the person who made this. What was their story? I imagined it was a woman. And again, fairly far into the revision of this book, I was looking at the border, and what I thought was this. I thought of it in terms of the M dash, which is the longer of the dashes that we use. And I incorporated it into what is essentially the table of contents, and all in an attempt to imitate and reinforce this idea of the rug, and then in particularly the edges, the border. So those are just a couple of, I guess, 3 different ways that for me, I guess what I wanted to leave the idea with is that I really began to experience the text itself and the manuscript itself as if it were a textile. I mean, this is a fiction, but it really became to me, I started thinking of it in that way. So I'm going to leave it there and then see where our discussion goes. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I'll pick it up then and play a little bit on ideas that Audrey has on displacement, dispersal, and the interconnection between text and textile. And I just have to say, I am just completely honored to be here today. I'm as far away as you can get from being able to do textile work. So I'm very humbled by being surrounded by people who do this incredible work. So I just want you to know that I have examined cloth work in the literary arts, but I am not a textile artist whatsoever. My paternal grandmother and my sister were and are both seamstresses and engaged as such, but I shied away from those arts in favor of reading, writing, and teaching. I mean, there's a whole story behind that too, but it's a generational thing, really. But the textile arts threaded their way back into my reading and my scholarship through analyses of women's domestic needlework, specifically in the Italian diaspora. That's where I began. I think it moved from there, but I wanted to keep that in mind. And the stories of women's work, and they were basically embroidered into their stories of movement and migration. So this idea of textile work and portability that Audrey talks about is something of also my interest in my scholarly work. So this ability to do this work allowed young women to go to other towns, to go to other countries, to go overseas. So I eventually expanded my thinking on these relationships between artisanal skills and women's migrations by examining a sampling. I was also trying to pun while I was writing this, trying to use as many textile words as I could in my writing. But American writers innovated on these pre-modern stories of weaving in order to explore the relation between handwork, resourcefulness, and mobility. So I looked at such authors as Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Sandra Cisneros's Caramello, and Adria Bernardi's Open Work. And I'll go back to Adria at the end here in one of the slides. So this is a sort of swath of writers, US writers, who all portray variation of cloth working women in order to sort of highlight the relationship between their subversive artistry and all these institutional oppressions that required resistance from these women. So inevitably, it seems that cloth working activity generates various forms of movement. So it allowed me to examine these novels that really hadn't been examined this way before through the lens of migration, because these women were on the move, and their cloth working allowed them to move and make changes in their domestic life and in social codes in their societies. Whether they were 17th century women, Hester Prynne, for example, in Hawthorne's novel, or mountain village women from 19th century Italy. And I'm thinking, of course, of Adria's novel, Open Work. So the ramifications of cloth's portability, its movement, cannot be overemphasized. Stowed in trunks, sent across oceans, enriching maritime navigations, worn across shoulders, and I was thinking there of the Mexican rebozo, sewn inside one's clothes. I was thinking specifically there of seamstresses from Auschwitz who managed to maintain their lives as a result of their ability to do cloth work. All of these cloth metaphors and activities remain a constant reminder of these social ties that bind kinship groups while simultaneously prompting cross-cultural exchange. So the manifold potentialities of cloth to tie, to express, to unravel, to mend, likewise then encouraged me to examine works across different time periods and cultural groups, threading their connections. So an anthropologist named John Michael Vlach explains that accounts by textile workers are not often written but with words, but, and I'm quoting him, things made by the work of their hands. So Vlach examines the artifacts of historically 18th and 19th century disenfranchised Black women. And he's thinking specifically here of quilt work, recognizing the indispensable story that emerges from their unconventional documents. There's that idea again of text and textile, explaining that if we can learn to read them, then we can effectively travel back to specific times and places and recapture worlds that were either lost or obscured by willful forgetfulness. So a scholar who looked at English Anglo art, Rosiska Parker, states in The Subversive Stitch, to know the history of embroidery is to know the history of women. Another scholar of folklore wrote, Greek women do not speak, they weave. And a more recent artist from Sardinia, and I talked to Cameron and Audrey about this, Maria Lai has said, to be is to weave, as she moves in her own artistry from looms to sewn canvases and to the use of threads in books. So that leads me to the first image by another artist I want to introduce us to because I think she's wonderful. And I just wanted to show you just a tiny bit from her. I chose this artist for the cover of my 2016 book. Go back one more, Cameron. That one, perfect, yeah. And this particular piece is called Great Grandmother's Ocean. It's actually just a detail. It's much larger when it was shown in the installation. But I wanted to introduce you to this textile artist, Bia More. And she allowed me to use the cover for my book on women writing cloth, but I wanted to make sure I used a textile artist, an actual artist. So I asked for permission for this image. This image originally came from a 2000-2001 Ellis Island installation, which Bia More, her real name is Benedetta, but don't tell her I told you that. She goes by Bia More, that's her art name, her artist's name. But she initially created an installation for the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side of New York in 1998, utilizing both images and oral histories preserved by that museum. And then she made 6 large-scale triptychs with the history of each family written in gold on the doors of the center, filled with collaged photos of several generations of individual families who had lived in that tenement museum when it was an actual tenement. And I've got a postcard of that, should you want to see that in the Q&A. As Bea herself said, when I interviewed her, she felt that this was the way to give voice to people who were generally denied agency by the larger society. The large-scale triptychs were essentially shrines to each family, and this clearly related, this is Bea talking, to my own background in Italian and Catholic culture. So doing this tenement museum exhibit gave this textile artist the courage, this is from her, to propose Lifeline, Filo della Vita, to the Ellis Island Immigration Museum. Originally, Bea was offered a more traditional gallery space on the first floor, but as her plans evolved, the curator suggested 6 rooms on the 3rd floor, which had been the original dormitory rooms of all the immigrants that were coming through and they couldn't leave yet because they were ill or whatnot. There's a lot of stories about that. This entirely changed the scope of the exhibit, and she conceived of a narrative journey through generations of Italian immigrants. What I personally love about this detail that I chose for this book is that it was placed on the floor of the gallery, and it's a combination of soft and hard, light and dark, durable and fragile, appropriate metaphors to encapsulate the challenging experiences of movement and migration. And also the portability of cloth work, which leads me to our featured literary artist, Adria Bernardi, who's you can scroll ahead, Cameron, to that other image. Perfect, thank you. Her 2006 novel, which preceded her most recent book, Benefit Street, even though she was thinking about Benefit Street well before then. This is what I feel like, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong on this, Adria, what I think you were trying to do in the book. You offered a kind of paradigm of scattering or diaspora specific to the movements of Italian immigrants to portray this sort of transnational scope of their movements. And by doing that, you destabilize the given history of a certain area time called the Second Great Migration of Southern and Eastern Europeans to the Americas. And how does Adria do this in writing? Well, she talks about what she did in Benefit Street, but what she did in open work was collapse borders between narrator and author to challenge traditional separation between private and public histories, embracing, like Bia More's Lifeline exhibit, unofficial personal records of women's life through the trope of needlework. So structurally and thematically, the sewing of open work functions as a transnational symbol of mobility. It crosses borders and boundaries. And I believe Adria did this to secure a sense of permanence and a recognition that this kind of needlework depends on spatial openness. And this is what you see here in this detail, or actually this was an actual loan from Adria to me for my book. And it's a linen towel from, I think, her great aunt around 1915, 1920. And what this conveys is a kind of spatial openness, that patterns are formed with holes and threads, and they're pulled through an endless variation and tension. And when you read Adria's book, that's what you see in the book too. There are a lot of spaces in the text. So that's what those were the two images I was thinking of when invited here today to talk about that relationship between text and textiles. So thank you. I'm going to pass it on to Cameron now.
All right. So I'm going to just move on to my presentation and not stop screen share. You can see my smiling face a little bit later. So, so Judy asked me to start my presentation by showing you my garage studio spaces and giving you some background on what takes place here. So here are the two doors that open into what I'll call my weaving universe. So this is a two-story garage at the back of our home in Los Angeles. And the door to the left is the top floor, which leads to my personal studio where I am right now. And the side door on the first floor leads to the arts garage area, which is where I teach. So this is the interior of my studio space. It has lots of light, and it's never this neat when I'm actually working, but you get a sense of when I'm sitting at my loom, I'm looking at my yarns. And when I'm sitting at my desk, I'm looking either at my computer screen or out at our fig tree, which is what you see through those windows. And these two spaces are where I spend the majority of my time, Monday through Friday. So this is the downstairs, which literally was an unfinished garage space. And about 10 years ago, I turned it into a teaching space. And the nice thing about Los Angeles is most of the time, at least when we're not expecting a tropical storm, it's an indoor-outdoor space. And the right side, the right image, shows what it looks like when it's set up for a weaving class. I have a weaving curriculum that I teach here about once a month. And I have 6 looms and 6 students most of the time. And so that's what goes on to the right. And then the left side is this is a kind of a special event. I do special events just because I'm very committed as an educator to kind of sharing how wonderful weaving is and what a part of our culture it is. So I'm on the board of the UCLA Fowler Textile Council, which is it's on the UCLA campus, and it has student members. So I invited student members of the Fowler Textile Council to come join me at Arts Garage a few months ago. And we basically went through the technology of weaving in one afternoon. So I started them off with weaving bands, and then we did some frame loom weaving, and then we did some work on the looms that you see at the right. So it's a pretty busy space, and I'm really enjoying what goes on at Arts Garage. So in terms of my work, the first thing I wanted to talk about was a little bit about portability. And my husband and I travel quite a bit, and I'm always taking photographs. And I like to think of the textiles that I make as extremely portable, because right now, given that I have a website and I'm active on Instagram, my textiles and my stories are quite literally worldwide. And I don't need a trunk. You know, all I need is a website and an email address and a social media account. So it's a comparatively recent and quite wonderful development as far as I'm concerned, because an individual artist and also an organization like Warp, we can tell our stories without having to go through any kind of gatekeeper. And I think that's very empowering when it's used properly. So specifically getting to my textiles, all of my textiles tell some kind of story. And this particular story, the Lava Fold series, my family shown here at an opening a few years ago with the Lava Fold series behind us. So my family and I took a trip to Galapagos a few years ago, and my son took some incredible detail shots of lava flow, which to me is another story about looking versus seeing, because we were on exactly the same trip, and I hadn't looked at the landscape in the same way and would have completely missed this particular view had he not shared it. But to me, his photographs of these details of lava looked like folds of fabric, and they became a starting point for the series. And then I added red to symbolize the hot lava as it used to be. So this next piece is more recent. This actually is the last piece that I completed. Reflections North Lake Tahoe. It's inspired by some photographs I took of an unusually early snowfall on fall foliage. Don't say that too quickly. Fall foliage in the Eastern Sierra. And when I look at this image, I remember our hike. I remember the odd juxtaposition of snow and fall color, the smell in the air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the reflection of the mountains in the lake. And this piece, as the whole reflection series explores, is the interplay of real and reflected, positive and negative, warp and weft, and in this particular case, autumn and winter. And my process with this particular type of textile is the photograph is printed onto cloth, it's deconstructed, and then it's woven into a textile, which is then layered and stitched into some kind of abstracted image. And the abstraction of the image, I like to think, encourages you, the viewer, to create your own story when looking at the work, because unless you hear me talk about it or read a wall label that describes the motivation behind it, you're bringing your own story and your own interpretation to this piece. So another story about this particular piece is it will be part of an exhibit opening at the Craft in America Center next month called Influences Influencers. And part of what the director, curator, Emily Zayden asked us to do was to describe some of our influences. And I named some of my earliest influences as the artist Ed Rossbach and Annie Albers, because they both experimented with unusual materials and they referenced textiles from many different cultures in their artwork, which I do. So Mr. Rossbach, Professor Rossbach, taught a class at UC Berkeley where he pulled textiles he had collected from all over the world from his suitcase, talk about portability, and he shared their stories with us, their culture, how they were used, how they were made. And as a result of this class, I have always connected with textiles as the ultimate example of material culture. So this last series of images tells a different story, and this is where I'm headed with my next piece. And this is a staircase in Lyon in France. And there are photographs of a stairway in a building. And Lyon was a historic center of silk weaving. And this building used to house the silk weavers who lived and worked here in small apartments. And their jacquard looms were positioned next to the windows to get their best light. And each family lived behind the weaving area in cramped quarters. So I'm starting thinking about how to turn these images into one of my textiles. And I look at the images, I think about the many feet of the weavers and their families that went up and down the stairs, wearing down the stone with their passing. I hear the noise of the looms. I feel the vibrations of the weaving process. I smell the sweat of the weavers working on a hot summer day. And I think about the wives and children going up and down this stairway multiple times a day and how the echoes of their conversations and footfalls in the stairwell. So I'm not exactly sure yet how I'll tell the story, but something will emerge. And how things emerge for me are really in a process very similar to my writing process. I start with a big idea, and then I work towards it in a nonlinear kind of way. I think about all the different things I want to say, and with bits of yarn and fabric, I build out my ideas, and I only land on the final arrangement after quite a bit of experimentation. And that's very similar to my writing process, where instead of a loom, I use a computer, moving my ideas around via sentences and paragraphs until the flow seems right. So what this image shows is the beginning of my design process with my Lyon pieces, photographs. I print images onto opaque and translucent organza. I select potential warp and weft yarns, and then from there, I make small experiments until I feel comfortable moving to a wider warp for the finished piece. So each of these three images, and this is where I'm still kind of thinking about it, they could evolve into separate pieces in a series, or perhaps I'll intermingle them, or perhaps both. And I'm also, for you weavers out there, I'm thinking of using a satin weave in the woven part of the piece as a further homage to the silk weavers of Lyon. So this, I think I've reached the end of my part of the presentation. I'm going to stop the share, and there we go. Okay. What's next?
So here we are. Here we are to a time when we can have a few questions or comments. I see Carol had mentioned that you've stimulated memories of living in Lyon with your images. So I guess for me, I think listening to all three of you, that story is sort of central to the discussion here today. You know, the story that inspires your series, Cameron, the stories that Mary Jo has mentioned, and of course, Adria's story that sort of has textile interwoven among it. So my question is, let's see how I can say this. does the story come first and then the novel, or the weaving? Does the weaving begin and then a story emerges? I mean, I guess it's a question about your creative process.
Mhm.
How would you say that works? And I want to start with Adria, and then maybe the others would also comment.
So I'll talk about Benefit Street. And I think when I knew I had that it was a book, because it was a short story first that was written that involved that second part of the reading, Emish, and the character who is called the missionary's wife, who are in relationship because Emish needs another job. And she basically is working these two different jobs. One is a caretaker, and then she is also weaving to generate more income. And that had been written. And then really what happened is I heard Shiva's voice. So I think I had been thinking about conceptually lots of different things: displacement, what I was reading in the news, the textiles I live among, and my question about it, over the years, wondering who is this person who made that rug? And in my imagination, it was a woman. It was always a woman that I imagined. And I think for me, with each of my novels, and in this way also with nonfiction poetry too, it's like there's a voice and there's a line or there's a sentence or there's maybe a paragraph sometimes, and I think that's outside of me, that is not me, right? It is outside of me. And I think I have to listen to this. I don't know where it's going to take me, but I have to listen to it. And then I commit to writing whatever I can, every day, and to just accept what comes. And then over time, you start seeing associations. You start seeing, what I think of as the elements. You start seeing certain words appearing, certain word patterns appearing, certain sounds, certain sound patterns. And because it's as long as I trust that voice, in this case, Shiva's, it was like, that's what I followed. That's what I followed. She told me what it was I needed. And then the revision process is different, but in that part of where it comes from, it comes from reading, it comes from music, it comes from relationships and memories. And Italo Calvino, the writer, talks about the fantasfera, the fantasphere, where these things somehow come together, in ways that I don't think we can really explain, but it's intellectual, it's physical, it's physiological, it's psychological, it's all those things. And somehow, a voice like Shiva's emerges. And then I think for me as the writer, I have to say, okay, trust it, just don't doubt yourself. This is one of those moments. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That's fascinating. Cameron, do you want to
Oh,
add
sure.
to
I
that?
can. I don't know that I will be as articulate as Adria just, but I'll do my best. So earlier in my weaving career, the stories came out more from the process of weaving itself, because I was really interested, and I might go back to that, but I was really interested in just the idea that whenever I still am, whenever I sit at a loom, I'm sitting referencing history of people and cultures from all over the world that go way back. And so there's something incredibly powerful in that. So that story is really embedded in anything that I weave. But before I started doing the photographs, the story was more about, so what are the colors of a particular culture I'm interested in, or what are some structures that I want to explore, and maybe what's their historical significance. So it was always connected to a story, but not necessarily a story that anybody else could see. Whereas in the last, 10 years or so, with the photographs I take of travel and textiles and the people who make them, those stories, because they're more visual and they're starting with visual prompts, I think it's easier for someone to see one of my photographs and I can say, yeah, that's a stairway in Lyon. And that's why I took this. But I mean, I was with several other people walking up and down those stairs, and I was the only one who stopped and took those particular images. So it's partly what you're looking for, what you choose to see, what your background is, being open to just looking at what's around you, and stopping and taking it in. And I take photographs without any particular end in mind often. And then I get home and I delete a lot. I think about which images are the most powerful for me and which are the ones that I might want to use. And from our trip, that was a 3-week trip, that one day and that one stairwell and those 3 images are the ones that that speak to me the most. So,
Wow.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Mary Jo, what do you think about all this?
I think that these 2 artists are amazing, and I'm just learning so much about how they do their process. I come from a different area study, so I looked at these books initially simply because I started seeing threads everywhere, but it was sort of serendipitous because I happened to go to a small conference called Biancaria. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Adria, but it's about whiteware, and it's about the kind of bridal linens that were made for often working class women were doing this for women who had more wealth for their trousseaus. And so I went to this conference, and many of the women who were there, who were scholars and knitters, scholars and quilt workers, scholars and weavers. And I was asked to say, oh, can you contribute an article on the relationship between storytelling and weaving? And I said yes, and then I never heard from them again. And 10 years later, they said, can we have that article? We're ready to publish the book now. And I was like,
Of course.
oh my God. I just pretended like I kind of was going to do it. And so I had to do all this research on it. And I started focusing on women's domestic needlework, Italian women's domestic needlework, and that started the process. I didn't know what I was doing. I had to do a lot of work, and then I started seeing threads everywhere. And there's a reason that Hester Prynne lavishly puts an A on her garment, and it's filigreed, and she's committed adultery, and she refuses to name the guy, right, with whom she committed it, and she puts this lavish A because the men in the town require her to do it, but she's sort of subversive in the way she writes. She puts the most beautiful A you can possibly imagine on her breast, and there she's holding the baby. So that got me started on it. And I don't know what Hawthorne was thinking. I think Hester got away from him, and it was his best book as a result of that. And I wanted to put him in conversation with women from the 20th century. So I got involved in thinking about Sandra Cisneros and the Mexican Rebozo. That got me thinking of Adria Bernardi and Cameron's work with the fleckos that come down from the weave. That's what Cameron, your piece looked like, the lava piece. And then that reminded me of the Sardinian artist, Maria Lai, that I mentioned. So it's just very exciting how it moves from one thing to another. And if I can just say one more thing, because Adria made me think about it the last time we talked. Even before I knew what I was doing, when I put together this little book of poetry that I wrote about the AIDS quilt back in when it was first shown in DC 1996. And I tried to make each stanza look like a quilt, right? And I used sort of blank verse, which is just like 12 beats. And I tried to keep it consistent. So it looked like if you were going through the names quilt, there were spaces in between. And so, I mean, I did that before I kind of even got involved in the scholarly end of it. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Audrey, because I hadn't thought about it like that before.
We've had a lot of comments in the chat, mostly about other books that people are thinking of as we're all talking. And one person asked specifically, where can they find the book Women Writing Cloth?
Oh, probably. I mean, I hate to say this, on Amazon, I mean.
Okay.
And it's expensive. So if you want some of it and you want me just to send you stuff, I will do that too. I'd be
That's very
happy to
kind.
do it. Because it's hardback, and the prices of hardback, it's just prohibitive.
Yeah.
All right. So are there any people who've been commenting would like to jump in and ask a question or make an additional comment? You're free to do so at this time. Otherwise, I'm going to go to Adria, who told me that she has lots of questions she'd like to ask her fellow panelists.
I do. I'm a word person, so I always come prepared with
There
text.
she is.
Not
I
only does
think
she
one of
have
the things that
questions, she
I was
types
really
them.
interested in talking about. What? I missed it. What did you say,
I
Mary
said,
Jo?
not only do you have questions, but you typed them up.
I did. Of course I did. And then I revised them. So numerous times.
Very good.
But it's just a way to deal with anxiety. What can I say? I think there were two things that I was thinking about when I saw the images that Mary Jo and Cameron had when I first saw them. And one was with Cameron's, the photographs that you took of the silk weaver's workspace and the staircases, looking down. And I think, is there one looking up too? Is it from both ways? But anyway, there's a sense of this like volume and, in time and space. And when I was printing out the, because after our first discussion, our practice run, I added the image of the folded manuscript, which is like really bulky. It's about this big because it doesn't go down. And I took the photograph, and when I looked at the photograph, it was just like, oh my God, there are like these folds in here. I mean, intellectually, it was like, yes, it's folded, right? I mean, intellectually, conceptually, but and I'd wrestled with this mass of, sort of using clips to put it together. But what I saw were the folds after seeing Cameron's images and then re-seeing lava folds. So this idea of folds, and it just resonated with, for me anyway, with the tactile, how much for me the tactile was part of imagining this book. It was physiological. And I really sort of convinced myself that, in fact, if this was a textile, that's a fiction. It's not, but that's the fiction. And then the other thing too was that the connection between Mary Jo, you're talking about the space, the way that Biamore's piece was experienced differently when it was in the tenement museum, in the living quarters. And the natural connection for me was to back to Cameron.
Yep.
And the space that these people whose histories we don't know are made alive again. Just the connection between those two parts of your conversations.
Cameron, you want to go?
What was the question?
I didn't really have a question. The question was more that I was really struck by the associations of basically inhabiting this space that was once inhabited by workers, and by people who worked with their hands, and the artist, the scholar coming into this space and then retelling a story.
So what I didn't say about that stairway is that whole building has been converted into apartments, like regular apartments, right? That whole area. And we rented one as an Airbnb.
Wow.
So we lived in that building for 4 nights, for 3 days, 4 nights. And we also, because Leon is really good about telling the story of the silk trade, and there were associations in our neighborhood that we visited that showed what the original apartments looked like, where they had some equipment and you could see what the living space looked like, what the weaving space looked like. So we were able to juxtapose that with the apartment that we lived in and think about the different way that we experienced that space versus the way that a family would have experienced that space, which was really incredible. And I just love that that sense of history and all those stories were there. And so even though the apartments were transformed, it was the same staircase. And I loved walking. We were on the walking up 4 flights and just, you know, every time we had to go in and out, you were up, 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 down, 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 down. And I was walking the same path that all those families had been walking since the 1800s, which was really powerful for me. So
the
someone wanted to
photographs
know
are powerful.
somebody wants to know the name of the building in Lyon.
it just had an address. I mean, you know, it was, there were many, that whole section, it's the section of Lyon that's on the plateau, and it's the section where all the silk weavers lived and worked. And so all of those buildings have been converted into other uses because there really isn't much of a silk weaving industry there anymore. So mostly it's just housing. So there's nothing special about that particular building. You know, there were blocks and blocks of buildings like that.
Wow.
So when I looked at Cameron's slide.
Thank you, Carol. I'm glad Carol just said the area is known as, and I don't speak French. So does someone who speaks French knows how to La Croix-Rousse?
La Croix-Rousse.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, there you go.
So when Cameron was talking, when you showed us the slide of the stairwell, I thought automatically, like Audrey said, of the tenement museum. And now, of course, it is a museum. So there's the conversion. When it's good to take a tour there in the middle of summer, like let's say July 15th, when it's hot and humid and miserable. And you take the tour and you go up the 5 floors, and everything's dark, everything's, you know, hot, it's sweltering, and you get just a little sense of how these people suffered. Because then when you go into the rooms, they're redone, right? And they're trying to give you a sense of the ethnic group that lived there, whether it's Irish or Jewish or Italian. And it's beautifully redone, but that stairwell is what gives you the sense of how difficult their lives were and how they were able to survive because of the textile work. For example, on the Lower East Side, which was huge in the early 20th century, before everything started going out of New York. But you're right, Cameron, it's just the sense of going up and down yourself, just to give a little idea, which doesn't give you really anything ultimately, of how these people had to work in order to make ends meet. So that's what I thought of, Audrey, when you asked that question, the connection.
Okay, we have a question from Lee Langstaff. She says, I love the strong sense of migration and interconnection across time, as well as geographical migration. As a shepherd, so a fiber producer and spinner, this is a throbbing current. She'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
The relationship between movement and handwork?
Yes. She says migration and interconnection across time.
So I can start. You know, I think what I'm thinking about is picking up a little bit on what Mary Jo was talking about in terms of portable skills. And I think my own, like Mary Jo, I don't work with cloth. I mean, I'm proficient to mend and hem and those kind of things, but I don't. Although that said, it was always surrounding me. And so my great aunt, my Tia Teresa, whose work Mary Jo showed, was, you know, was a very accomplished seamstress. And she in a sense brought that skill because she did laundry. She did ironing in her own home. That was how she made her living. My grandmother was a seamstress. My grandmother, who was taught by, as they say in Italian, le suore, she went to the suore and learned her needlework. You know, the girls from the countryside would go, and like Mary Jo said, they would, you know, it would be a skill that they had all their lives. That's how my mother's mother made her living, making drapery. My other grandmother was always doing some sort of crocheting or knitting, and her sister, I have a piece of work that her sister made, which is a crocheting of a tiny, tiny, tiny little doll's apron. That, you know, the story I tell is that she made it for her younger sister, right? So this came with my grandmother. These linens came with them. And the three of us talked about this a little bit in a previous conversation, where I didn't really ever see this stuff. I mean, it wasn't like it was out displayed, like I put it on my walls and using it. No, no, no. It was like sacred, and it was hidden, not hidden, but it was just kept away. And so I think, and you know, my mother only recently has brought out works of her grandmother and her aunt. So this would be my grandmother's mother and my grandmother's aunt and her mother, of these incredible needlework, combinations of different kinds of needlework. And so I think I feel very connected on both sides of the family, to these women, and kind of what they gave me, you know, what came my way, in terms of strength, in terms of comforting, all these things, you know, that, you know, I look and I think, oh my God, how did they do this? You know, it's astounding to me, really, you know. And they made these very beautiful works of art. And so I guess to go back to the question that was asked, I mean, these are the things that they could take with them. These are the things my grandmothers could take with them. These are the things my aunt could take with. And I think that the towel that was with the open work, I think that was from her trousseau, because it has her, you know, her initials
Right,
are on it.
right.
And anyway, yeah, so they came from Italy, you know, in, you know, 1920, then 1928, and then 1939, when my grandmother, my maternal grandmother came. So yeah, I mean, they connect a story to them and back to their beginnings.
Very good. Well, I see that we're past our closing time. Is there anything Mary Jo or Cameron would like to add before we wrap things up today?
Well, I don't know if Barbara McCann is still here. But, oh, there's Barbara McCann. I have a colleague in art history whose name is Barbara Frank, and she does African history and art. So be in contact with me and I'll connect you two up, because she just won a major award for her art history book in African art, and I'd love to connect with you on that.
I just would like to say thank you. Oh, go ahead, Cameron.
I just realized, so I didn't mean to interrupt, I'm sorry. So I'm seeing lots of discussion about Lyon and places to visit related to textile history there. And I don't know how many of you follow the podcast Haptic and Hue, but if you don't, you should. She did a presentation on Lyon, and I know she's working on a textile resource guide to Lyon that she's going to be releasing soon, similar to the Paris guide and the London guide. So just keep your eyes on that. I think that could be a really fun adventure once that's published.
Great.
So.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Mary Jo, how do I get in touch with you?
Oh, I will give Kelsey my email address,
Okay.
and then she's going to give it to you, and then we're going to be in contact.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I have one comment I'm concerned about. I worked on women's rights professionally in developing countries for many, many years. And one of the things I looked at when I was collecting textiles was the role of women and men within the whole process of producing cloth, from spinners and weavers to dyers. And what was fascinating was to look at who produced it and who sold the cloth and what happened to the money from the production of the cloth.
Exactly.
It's really quite something to see, a worldwide phenomenon of that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I first met my husband in Tunisia, and it was very interesting because the women were, one of you mentioned, they do not speak, they weave, and that's what it was like in Tunisia, women working out of their homes.
Right.
And the men would then take the carpets to the
Right.
market
Yeah.
and sell the carpets. So it was,
Yeah.
in terms of who benefits economically from the
Yep.
production, is a very interesting aspect of this whole
Yes.
textile
Yes, it
production.
is.
That might be the topic for a future
Yeah.
conversation, I think. That's a very good
Exactly.
one. We haven't gotten into that particular aspect of this, but I think it's appropriate, and we'd have a lot of people that would have something to say about it.
Yeah.
And it draws men into the discussion as well.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So, Adria, do you have any final words you want to leave us with?
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's
Thank
just
you.
been wonderful. And thank you. I mean, to what Mary Jo said, I'm just so grateful, and really, to be invited into your world is just, it means a lot. And I just thank you from the bottom of my heart. So thanks.
Well, your presentations, all of you, have been very inspiring to us. Lots of comments in the chat about that, how beautiful they are. Your presentations are all like poetry, one person said. So it's
And Warp's work, I just applaud what you're doing. It's so inspiring, and your the interviews are so inspiring. The other presentations are so inspiring about the work of artisans around the world. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for being part of our world,
Thank you.
all of you. So to wrap things up, we do this every month, and I think we have a program coming up for next month that some of you will be sure to want to tune into. Do you want to give us a little sneak preview, Kelsey?
Sure, Judy. So next month we will have Bricia Karlovich Logan, who is the founder of Women's Woven Voices, which is an international collaborative art project that promotes women's empowerment. So we'll be joined by Bricia and some of her team members.
Great.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for being part of this. It's always great to be with you.